Hi, my name is Victoria. I'm the coordinator of ReimagineReview, and welcome to our community call on combating peer review bias. So just a reminder on what ReimagineReview is. It is a community of innovative peer review projects. Many of them are journal-run and also independent, and we're all very interested in learning effective methods of identifying and preventing bias. So towards that end, we decided to organize this community call, and we have two expert speakers, Dr. Jennifer Raymond, who has led the gender bias study at eLife, and Dr. Misha Teplitskiy, who has conducted research on peer review bias that arise from social structure. So just to remind you of the agenda, we will begin with the two presentations that will be shown via this conference call via screen share. And those two will be 10 minutes long each, and they will be recorded. We will promptly stop the recording after Misha's talk, and you can begin to ask questions. So to ask questions to the speaker, please add your questions to the shared doc that we sent you in the invitation, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute your audio and you can address the questions directly. So first we have Dr. Jennifer Raymond, and she will be talking to us about her work. So we can begin the screen share.
Okay. Okay. Does everyone see my slides?
Yeah, everyone see?
I cannot see your screen yet.
Okay, let me do some more clicking. Okay, there we go. I think I've got it now. And
great, we can see your screen.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Jessica and Victoria, for organizing this conversation. And I'm really pleased to have this chance to share some of our recent results. They're published on bioRxiv, so you can go and find out more there. I'll just kind of do the highlights of the study we did of peer review at eLife. And here I list the collaborators on this. Cassidy Sugimoto was the co-senior author with me, and Dakota Murray was the intrepid grad student who really did all the work with a bunch of leaders and only one person doing the work. I also wanted to remember to acknowledge eLife's support. The leadership at eLife was very supportive of this, and this work was only possible because they were so open with sharing the data, and that's rare to have such transparency. So they really deserve credit for that. Okay, so I'm going to talk about what we found, which is evidence for a form of bias in peer review at eLife that correlates with the correspondence between demographic characteristics of the author and reviewer. So we call this homophily, and we saw this looking both at gender and nationality. And as many of you on this call probably know, there have been a lot of studies looking at whether there are disparities in the success rates for authors, scientists based on their gender or nationality in the peer review process. And sometimes disparities have been found, but the results are kind of mixed. And even if there's a disparity in success rate, as we'll discuss, it's not always clear that that's driven by bias. So we were trying to get at some of this, and again, because eLife released all of their data to us at the time we started the study, which was 2017, we were able to look at a really large data set, 23,000 manuscripts that had been submitted from the inception of the journal in 2012 up until 2017. And we found there was a difference in success rates. So this shows that at each stage of the review, we saw a disparity. So I don't know if you can see my pointer as I do this, but the encourage percent, that's what happens during the editorial triage. And we saw that male authors were somewhat more likely, significantly more likely to have their manuscript go for full peer review or selected for peer review. And then once it went out for peer review, then the chance of acceptance was also higher. So when we put these two stages together, we found that overall manuscript from a male corresponding author had a 15.6% chance of acceptance versus 13.8% for a female corresponding author. So there was a gender disparity in the success rates. at each stage in peer review. And this came, we saw this only when we looked at the senior authorship role. So what I'm showing here is the results for corresponding author. If we looked at if we broke it down by the gender of the first author, we saw no significant difference between acceptance rates for female versus male first authors. And we only had first and last author information for the full submission. So the editorial triage stage, we only had corresponding author information, but we could look at when the full submission came in. Could we explain the difference in outcomes based on other authors' genders? And we also saw there was a clear effect of last author gender. But it's the senior authors. This made sense to me because often if I'm reviewing a paper, I know the senior author, and I pay attention to that, and I might not even notice the name of the first author. Okay, and this difference could explain some of the differences in the literature, because a number of the cases where people found no gender difference in success rates, they were looking at the first author rather than the senior authors. Okay, so we posted this on bioRxiv and we got a lot of feedback, and I think the most common feedback, we got a lot of positive feedback, but the most common negative feedback was, well, your effect size is small. Come on, 2%. What are you complaining about? Why are you making a big fuss? I don't think 2% is the right way to think about this. If it was 10% success for female and 40% for male, we wouldn't say that's a 30% difference. We'd say it's a fourfold difference. So I think it's the ratio here that really matters. And if we take the ratio of these two success rates, then we see a 13% advantage for male authors, which I think is not really so small at all. And especially when you consider that advantages like having your manuscript accepted to a high-profile journal can compound over time. So if you publish a good paper, you're more likely to get the students and postdocs and the funding that will give you the next paper. So these advantages, I think, are actually significant in terms of their real-world effect. We also saw differences in success rates based on the country of the corresponding author. And these effects nobody could call small at all, right? 23% of manuscripts from the US were accepted, 22%, but it drops off precipitously as you go to the other countries on the list of the largest submissions. So we see differences in success rates, but differences in success rates doesn't necessarily mean there's bias in the peer review process, because there are many factors outside of peer review that could influence the actual quality of the science that's submitted by authors from different groups. So for example, we know that women faculty spend more time on domestic responsibilities than their male colleagues. This could take time away from their science. There was a recent study in The Lancet about women getting less funding than their male colleagues. There's work showing that women get less mentoring. So all of these things could actually influence the quality. There could be a difference in quality coming from scientists from different groups. So just because there's a difference in acceptance rates, that doesn't mean there's bias in the peer review process. And I think it's important to point out that these effects outside of the peer review could affect the quality in either way. So one study that's really influenced me is this one by Niederle and Vesterlund, which suggests that some of the most qualified women opt out of competitions. And we saw some evidence that this might be occurring at eLife too, that women may be self-selecting out of the competition to get their work published there. Because only 23% of submissions came from a female corresponding author, whereas somewhere around 30% of faculty in the biosciences are women. And so there's kind of an underrepresentation of women in the submissions as well, suggesting women may be more reserved in trying to get their work published. And because of that, equal acceptance rates doesn't necessarily mean that there's no bias. So we can't infer the presence or absence of bias based on acceptance rates. So how do we get at this? I think the ideal approach would be the standard in clinical science and in basic science, which is to do a randomized control study, assign incoming manuscripts to a case where the author's names are available to the reviewers or not. That's not a perfect study, but it would go a long way to really finding out whether there's differences in acceptance rates when the reviewers don't know who the authors are. To my knowledge, no one in the biosciences has done such a study. And so we did what we think might be the second best thing. And it was based on the logic that if the difference in acceptance rates reflected differences in the actual quality of the manuscripts coming from different groups, then those differences should be seen regardless of who's judging the science. But if there was some kind of bias, then maybe it would vary based on who was doing the reviewing. So we asked, do all reviewers judge manuscripts from male and female and from US and non-US authors in the same way? So many of you probably know a lot of biases are shared across groups. So men and women exhibit biases against women. Light and dark-skinned people exhibit biases against dark-skinned people. So why would we expect to see a difference based on who's doing the reviewing? There's some old work suggesting that although everyone to some extent shares biases, there are some variations across groups in the biases. And this shows some old work using an implicit association test, and everyone, male and female, subjects tend to view science as male, but the tendency to view science as male is enhanced in male scientists compared to men who are not scientists, so that's this curve. And the tendency to view science as male is reduced in female scientists as opposed to women in other professions. So if this difference in kind of implicit biases between male and female scientists is playing out in peer review, we thought we might see something there. And we did. So what we saw was that the male advantage in acceptance rates comes primarily from the cases where there was an all-male reviewer team. So if all of the reviewers were male, then men had a significantly higher success rate than the female authors. If the reviewers were mixed gender, then we saw that the acceptance rates for male and female authors were much more similar. So the difference in accept rates had to do not just with who was submitting the work, but who was evaluating the work. And we also looked at what happened when there were all-female reviewers. This was an extremely rare case. Only about 80 manuscripts out of 23,000 had all-female reviewers. But we did see a trend that maybe women, all-female reviewers tended to view female submissions more favorably as well. Okay, so a number of people point out, well, this is not a bias against women. And in some sense, that's true. It's a preference of male reviewers from submissions from male authors. And that's why we call this a homophilic effect, a preference for work from somebody who shares demographic characteristics. We saw a very similar homophilic effect based on nationality. So this shows that if at least one reviewer was from the same country as the authors, then the chance of acceptance went up quite a lot compared to the case where none of the reviewers were from the same country as the authors. But as we saw with the gender, whereas it was very rare for women to have all female reviewers, whereas male authors had about a 50-50 chance to have all male versus mixed reviewers. We saw the same thing, that the effects of homophilia are more likely to be experienced by certain authors. So a US author had about a 90% chance of having at least one reviewer from the US, but it drops precipitously for authors from other countries. Authors from the UK, only a 30% chance of having a reviewer from the UK, and by the time you get down to, say, Switzerland, there's only a 6% chance, and it just keeps dropping. Okay, so for those of you who are statistically inclined, we did a giant regression analysis. logistic regression to put into the same statistical model many of the potential confounds or covariates that could be accounting for the results. And when we did that, the homophilic effects persisted. One of the potential confounds that we considered was what the institutional prestige. And we found that if an author was from one of the top 50 institutions, as judged by the Times Higher Education World Rankings, that was one of the strongest predictors of whether the manuscript would be accepted. But even when we considered that, there was a persistent effect of this all-male reviewer for a male author manuscript. So if a manuscript was from a male author and reviewed by all male reviewers, there was a 22% increase in the chance of acceptance compared to a female author with all male reviewers. And when we looked at all of the other conditions, combinations of authorship gender and reviewer gender, the only one that was significantly different from this comparator case, last author female, all male reviewer, was the last author male, all male reviewer. None of the other conditions were significant. Okay, and then we also looked at a proxy for nationality in this. We looked at geographic distance. We took the distance between the centroids of the countries of the reviewers compared to the author. And for every 1,000 kilometers of distance, there was a 0.98 odds ratio, so a decrease in the chance of acceptance that just scaled with the distance between the authors and reviewers. Okay, so the conclusion of our study is that peer review outcomes vary with the match between reviewer and author demographics, and there seems to be a homophilic, a preference for work from someone. The reviewers have a preference for work from an author that shares demographic characteristics, and this suggests that there's some kind of bias that influences scientific peer review. And I would stress it's not necessarily gender bias per se or nationality per se, but it could be something that correlates with gender. And maybe we can discuss that in the discussion period. But the recommendations given these findings are that, first of all, there should be additional studies to quantify the influence of bias. We were very lucky to get the data from eLife. Other journals have not been so forthcoming with their data. So we would really encourage other journals to release their data. It would be very exciting to see if the nature of the review process could influence this effect. It might suggest that certain review processes are better than others in terms of mitigating these effects. And I mentioned already, I think a randomized control study of double-blind review would be useful because our analysis can only pick up biases that are not shared among different reviewers. And so it's likely to be an underestimate of the effect of bias on peer review. Other recommendations have to do with interventions. So I think this is makes a case that taking the names of the authors, the identity of the authors off of the manuscript would be a step in the right direction. It wouldn't be a cure-all, but I think it could help. And eLife is now recommending to all of its editors that they're mindful in making sure their reviewer pools are diverse. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Misha, and then would be happy to answer questions later.
All right, thank you so much. So we have a lot of questions and reflections already in the document. So please feel free to continue to add those. And meanwhile, we will listen to the second talk by Dr. Misha Teplitskiy.
All right, so hello everybody. Let me know if the sharing is working. Are we good on that?
It looks great.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
So great. So I'm Misha Teplitskiy. I'm at University of Michigan, and I postdoced at LISH, the Laboratory for Innovation Science at Harvard Business School. So I'll discuss 3 studies from our group, and it'll be, of course, just highlights. but happy to discuss more in detail all of this later. So I'll discuss 3 studies. The first talking about how intellectually close or far somebody is from the work they're judging, and also how novel the work is and how this affects evaluations, what community you're in, or what I'll call schools of thought, and lastly, this kind of emerging work on how we judge things in committees. So jumping into the first study here, I'll be talking about 2 sort of separate effects, intellectual distance and novelty. This was what Kevin Bedreau and co-authors published a few years ago. So the context, let me just close this little screen. So the context for this is a competition administered by Harvard Medical School a few years ago, soliciting endocrinology research proposals. So 150 of these came in. There were 142 reviewers, but each reviewer ended up doing a whole bunch of reviews. So in the end, there were about 2,000 reviewer proposal pairs. And the design was the following. So we wanted to understand the role of distance and novelty. So to measure novelty, we looked at the mesh terms in the proposals and took the sort of conventional measure that social scientists tend to use of saying that, the more unusual combinations that haven't been seen before are more novel. So that's how we'll define that. And the key kind of design feature of the study was randomly assigning reviewers from the pool to proposals. So that generated kind of exogenous variation in how distant or close somebody is to what they're reviewing. And also sort of crucially keeps the underlying quality or all features of the proposals constant on average. So what did we find? And how do I move my slide? Here we go. So here are the 2 findings. So left and right panel. So first, as far as intellectual distance between reviewer and proposal. So at the bottom on the x-axis, we have expert distance going from 0, very close, to 1, very far away. And on the y-axis is how good the score is, going from low 2 to high 10. And what we see here is a pretty kind of clear pattern that the farther away somebody was from the proposal, the better the score that they gave. This is kind of interesting because you can imagine this relationship going all sorts of ways. But here with actual random assignment, we have pretty kind of like much more conclusive evidence than usual that sort of the farther away somebody is, the fewer sort of problems they see in the work. Another crucial aspect of the study was novelty, right? So this is something, we worry about in the entire review process. Like, does it actually reward novel ideas? And here we have to be a bit more careful because this was not, with sort of an RCT, so the distance was an RCT, but the novelty wasn't. And so here on the x-axis, we have novelty going from very low to very high. Again, score going from low to high. And what we see is this U-shaped pattern. If we were to draw a line, we would find that, novelty is penalized. But if we look sort of more carefully or nonlinearly, we see that, sort of medium ranges of unconventional combinations of mesh terms are rewarded, but sort of the more rare, things get, the score becomes worse and worse. So sort of penalized at the very extremes, but rewarded at the medium. So there's lots going on here, happy to discuss later on. Moving on to the second study now. This came out, I guess, about a year ago, and it's looking at professional networks between authors and reviewers and how they affect evaluations. The data came from PLOS ONE, from the review of about 8,000 submissions in neuroscience. Thanks, as Jennifer said, journals aren't very forthcoming with these data, of course, so big thanks to PLOS ONE for providing this. So what we did was we looked up every reviewer and author and measured whether they had collaborated before. So this gives us a big network of authors and reviewers. some are going to be professionally kind of close to what they're reviewing, some are far. And the strengths of this study is that, because we have different reviewers for the same paper, we can look at only those cases and sort of keep the underlying quality of the paper constant. So the only thing that's going to change is how far or close somebody is to it. And here's what we found. So on the x-axis here is co-authorship distance going from 1, meaning you had collaborated at some point. 2 is, you collaborated with each other's collaborators, and so on. And the y-axis is how likely the paper is to get rejected. And what we see here is kind of sort of the opposite of what we saw in the study I showed right before, that the closer somebody is to the paper, the less they're likely to reject it. So pretty striking kind of pattern, consistent across different distances. What might be driving it? Is this same kind of co-authors, communities sharing priors for, what assumptions are valid or what methods are valid? Or is this nepotism? So if it was nepotism, we would expect, people very close to be sort of nepotistic and farther away, less and less so. So when you compare, let's say, 1 and 2, it's kind of hard to tell, right? So the co-authors might be favoring each other for all sorts of reasons. But what's kind of suggestive is that comparing 2 and 3, because by sort of conventional definitions, these are all kind of unconflicted reviewers. And what we find is this kind of preference persists at about the same amount going from 1 to 2 and 2 to 3. So even kind of looking further out into the distance, the closer someone is, the better for your chances of getting accepted. And lastly, jumping to the last paper, and I think kind of the emerging, sort of this is where we have the least evidence in the literature. So committees, right? So a lot of these decisions are actually made in, rooms like the picture I have here from a NIH study section. And so our goal in this last project was to understand interpersonal influence in these settings. So how do experts listen to each other or not, when you sit them down in a room? The context for this was a research proposal competition administered by Harvard Medical School. We received about 50 proposals, recruited about 277 reviewers, mostly faculty at Harvard, some and about 30% outside. And what we tried was the following. So the design was that people would evaluate proposals as usual. And this is a real competition with real money. And the awards were based on this sort of conventional process. So you review, we average them, and that's who gets the money. But on top of that, we layered on a sort of a second step. After recording your individual scores, we would provide anonymous scores from other reviewers. Other reviewers is in quotes because these were artificial scores that we sort of randomly generated. And when we showed these to people, we attributed them to either reviewers in the same or different disciplines and varied whether the scores given to you were high or lower. And then we gave you an opportunity to update your score. So this was, a battle with IRB to kind of justify why this kind of deceptive sort of task was worth doing to learn how this works. IRB complied, and so we did the study. And so what we're going to ask is, do people kind of have an in-group preference of the sort, do people listen more to people from the same discipline? Do they respond more to higher or lower scores? And crucially, who actually does the updating? So first set of findings is that giving people these, fake scores that they didn't know were fake resulted in about half of people changing their score. We found no evidence for people preferring one, like their own community or, another discipline. And very interestingly and sort of surprisingly to us, we found that there was a lot of kind of variation on who actually responds to this information. So first, we found that, what we might call superstars, so like very, very highly cited, reviewers, scientists updated a lot less than everybody else. Maybe not shocking, because we kind of can imagine what kind of person this might be in the back of the room, who doesn't care very much for what you have to say. And also crucially, we found that men updated a lot less than women, so about 13% less. And again, these were all sort of faculty, about equally, expert individuals. And what's also very revealing is that the updating really differed by the gender composition of the subfield. So here in this graph on the x-axis, I have how male or female dominated the field is, going from very male dominated to about parity. On the y-axis is how often people update. What we see is that men are pretty insensitive to kind of field compositional issues, but women update very, very differently depending on if they're sort of very underrepresented, very much in the minority, or in fields that have parity. So they update basically all the time when they're very underrepresented, but in fields that have parity, men and women update about the same amount. So there's these very systematic differences in sort of whose opinion ends up dominating in committee discussions. And lastly, and I think hardest to kind of make sense of, but very, I think, important for how we think about review, is how do people respond to receiving better or worse scores? Here on the x-axis, I have your original score that you gave, going from very bad, 1 or 2, to medium scores to very high, 7 or 8. On the y-axis is how often you updated. And what we find is that for people giving medium scores, there was no real effect for whether other people's opinions were better or worse than yours. But there was this huge difference between people who gave very good scores and very bad. So if you gave a very bad score, you were very unlikely to change it, no matter what other people thought. People changed it only about a quarter of the time. However, if you gave a very good score, you would, and you found out that others rated it lower, you would move your assessment down almost, more than half the time, right? About 2/3 of the time. And so what this really suggests, is that bad scores are sticky, right? Once you get them, they sort of stick, whereas getting good scores is actually much more fungible. And this could be due to sort of reputational concerns, we suspect. People don't want to look silly or overly lenient in front of their colleagues. So they sort of act kind of tougher than they maybe would if they were, in a closed room by themselves. And this has very interesting implications for evaluation in general, because what it means is that as an applicant, you really want to avoid getting bad scores. Like, you don't want to piss anybody off. But that's much more important to you than getting somebody very excited, because the excited person might change their score, whereas the pissed off person will stick with it. The last slide, summing things up here, what did we find? So intellectually close reviewers give worse outcomes for review. The highest novelty doesn't appear to be rewarded, but medium novelty is. Being in the same school of thought, which is a bit different from kind of intellectual proximity. Like, you could be intellectually proximate but have different takes on a particular question. But if you're in the same school of thought, you're intellectually proximate and have the same take. So being in the same school of thought yields much better review outcomes. And as far as committees, this is very much emerging kind of evidence that we need to make sense of. We find that bad scores are very sticky, and in general, people wittingly or unwittingly end up discounting opinions from kind of underrepresented or marginal social groups. And I'll stop there. Many thanks.